Thank you, everyone. Just to start, I wish to acknowledge that this meeting today is being held on Aboriginal land, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous people here today. I'd also like to start just by introducing myself. So my name's Rory. I head up the Behavioural Insights team's work in the region. I'm based here in Sydney. I came over here in late 2012, just as this sort of approach was starting to get embedded in government in the UK, to see if these sorts of approaches could work outside of Whitehall and Westminster and in Australia. And the good news is it's a resounding yes, and I think the fact that we've got this conference sort of packed to the rafters today, full of a stream of results, tells you that it's been an outstanding success. I guess the bad news is that I've enjoyed it so much, and again, our international delegates can see from the weather outside why, that you can't get rid of me. I'm now not leaving. So it's been a great sort of 4 or 6 years now in Australia, working very closely with the New South Wales unit and many other agencies now across Australia. So great to see you all here today. I'm going to introduce our other speakers as we go through the session, and we're going to try and keep the intros relatively short. I'm not going to read out Bruce and Robin's full bio and CV, but I'll give you just a quick flavour of where they're from. And in terms of the structure of the session today, I'm going to give a brief overview to start with, just about the sort of state of the field at the minute. What do we think about nudging BI? Where have we got to? Where is it at? And I'm going to outline a simple framework, a mnemonic. Any of you who've been to a BIT presentation before won't be too surprised about that, that will help think through what some of the critical success factors are when we're thinking about scaling. We're then going to hear from Bruce, who's going to talk through his experience applying this in the employment space. We're then going to have a video. Edwina, we found out a couple of months ago, couldn't make it today. She's at a conference actually in Europe, but I think the work that she's leading is so powerful, we wanted to keep that as part of this session. So we've got a video which I think really helps to bring to life, and actually a great example of scaling in practice. We've got Edwina joining us essentially by video. Then it's over to you. We're going to try a group exercise. Now, one of the bits of feedback we've had at a lot of the BX conferences is that people want more opportunities to have interactive discussions and exercises. They're always a bit high risk, high reward, which is why you haven't seen too many of them. But we're going to try here today. It's probably going to be a little bit noisy. It's going to be a little bit hot. We're trying to work on the air conditioning. But it's going to be an opportunity for you on your tables to start to think through what are the types of trade-offs and decisions you need to think through when you're scaling. This is not an easy thing to do. And we're going to try a little bit of a sort of role-play game to think for you, from your perspective, how you can take a particular intervention to scale. Once we've done that, we're going to have a bit of feedback. Robin is then going to pull it all together. So some of the questions that you've been asking through that group exercise, she's going to reflect on and give her thoughts on that. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit at the time, right at the end, for some Q&A. So I am going to ask you, just because it's a pretty tight agenda to get through, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end, if that sounds okay. So just before we kick off, as ever, standard conference presentation, just some quick definitions, just so we're all on the same page to start with. So nudges, this session is obviously called Taking Nudges to Scale. I mean, we could spend the next 90 minutes discussing is it a nudge or a boost or a budge or a shove or any of the other of the latest terms, but we'll sort of move over that and just think about this in the broadest sense, that this is any intervention which seeks to influence people's behaviour without banning or compelling them to do so. So an example would be moving fruit or low-fat drinks to eye level in a school or a canteen. Banning those sorts of drinks or food would not be. That would not be a nudge. So that's nudging. In terms of scale, again, various different definitions, but I'll lean on my learned friend Robin and our friends in the implementation science world, that you can broadly say you've reached scale once you reach 70% of the target population you are trying to reach. So that's the broad sort of definition we'll be going with. You are broadly reaching the majority, the strong majority of the population you're trying to reach. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the whole population. Sometimes you'll be targeting subgroups, and many of the examples here today will be in that realm, but we're looking at that sort of roll out through a system so you're reaching the majority of the people that you're attempting to. And in terms of routes to scale, there are a variety, and depending on which type of department and which levers you have at your disposal, there'll be different sets of routes to scale for you. So the most obvious, the sort of archetypal BI trial and scale is the small scale RCT, and then you sort of roll it out through a delivery system. And that is, again, a classic model, and we'll have some examples of that today, but that's not the only model. And I think as this approach matures, we're seeing different types of evaluation methods. So actually, Edwina's example from DV, we're doing a sort of quasi-experimental evaluation and trialing it at scale already. Some of the work that Bruce and others will talk through is actually where you run a trial and then it influences policy or even regulation. So there are different routes to scale, and the framework that we're talking through should apply to any of them. But the exercise that we're going to get you to work on is in that sort of classic type. It is that small-scale RCT that's worked, and then thinking about how we roll that out through a system. So where are we at in terms of BI and scaling currently? I think, if we're honest, it's a pretty mixed bag. And it depends really if you're sort of a glass half full or glass half empty perspective on this. So if we take the glass half full, as I'm often prone to do, since its various earliest days, nudges and BI have always had impacts at scale. So if you think about early days in the UK, pension enrolment, we've now got an additional 10 million workers in pension savings because of that change of the default. From the earliest days, the tax letters were being rolled out to millions of people, and our employment work, again, was rolled out through the system. We're talking about sort of 800,000 people going through a sort of new approach to the type of way they have conversations in job centres from the various earliest days. And the same is true now in Australia too. There are lots of examples which you'll hear over the next 2 days. I won't bore you with sort of a long list now, but examples like the domestic violence order has been rolled out across New South Wales. We've got new energy notices. So we do have lots of good examples. But if we're really honest with ourselves, the majority of interventions and projects that we've worked on haven't been taken to scale. So, it's been actually quite difficult. We've been trying to put a number on this, and I've spoken to quite a few practitioners to try and get a sense of what proportion do we think have been taken to scale, and people are understandably slightly reluctant to share that. But I think we would be confident in saying it's a minority. The majority of the interventions that we've been involved in, probably collectively around this room, haven't been taken to scale. And I think that's a big issue. I think, as ever with the approach, that is part of the journey and the evolution. You start with the sort of small wins, you make the proof of case. I think the fact that we've got to this point means we've done that to some extent. Obviously, we are also preaching to the converted in here. These are all people that are interested. There are many parts of the system that have never heard of a nudge. But I feel like we've reached that stage of maturity, and we should now have a much greater focus on scale and impact. And I think, actually, if you look at the sort of proportion of the results, and keep an eye out for it over the next 2 days, I think a lot of them will be focused on sort of new results, the innovation, the small-scale trial, rather than the big impact and the rollout across the system. So if that's the case, if BX was held here in Sydney 4 years ago, and we had a very small number of results in Australia, 4 years later, we've got a really great set of results now across the system. But I don't think we've reached our full potential. And if we come back in 4 years' time, if it comes back again, and we're having the same sort of conversation with lots of really interesting results, but not enough that have really changed the system, unfortunately, I think we'll be having a much smaller conference. We'll still have many of us, the sort of BI policy nerds and policymakers and academics who are super interested in it, but we'll probably have lost the attention of the really senior executives who their day in, day out is about changing systems and impacts at scale. So I think it's a real onus on us to work together over the next few years to make sure that that is the case. But of course, we're not alone. BI and sort of nudging is not alone in the challenge of taking this to scale. And if you look across the social innovation field, that is almost a sort of graveyard of really neat projects, etc., which haven't been taken to scale. And even areas like health, if you think about, again, various different stats, but it looks like, on average, it's more than a decade to get something from the research base into clinical practice. There is this very well-established evidence sort of practice gap, or the knowledge doing gap. So this is a problem across the system, and I think it's our job to look outwards to understand what those other approaches have learnt, and then to start to apply that internally to BI. So this is a quote from Lord Darcy, actually, about the health system, particularly in the UK. And he said, "We have a proud record of invention, but we lag behind in systematic uptake, even of our own inventions." And if I was being slightly self-critical, I'd say that the same is true of BI. Actually, we've got a great track record of being really creative, coming up with some great ideas, but how strong is our track record of rolling them out across whole systems? Probably not as strong as it could be. But there are structural and systemic reasons why that is the case. So if you look at something like health, where again the data is more readily available, annual spending on research and development in the NHS, 1.2 billion. Over a 5-year period, the amount of money being spent on spreading and scaling best practice and innovation, 50 million. So again, you can see that there's this pretty stark gap between how much money and time and effort is being spent on developing the R&D, the innovation, and how much time and energy is being spent then scaling it out and spreading. And I would say the numbers would be wildly different in the BI field, and the proportions would be slightly different. But if you think about the amount of sort of human capital, how much of our time and energy is being spent coming up with new ideas and trying to come up with different ways to tweak the system versus actually taking that and scaling it, not just in your own system, but applying similar lessons to other systems, I think there is that disjunct that we see in health as well. And just to give you a practical example, this is a trial that we've run both in the UK and in Australia. So in both Australia and the UK, more than 1 in 10 people don't turn up for the hospital appointment. That's a big problem, and again, we know that that's a problem that is across many public services. So we ran a trial, an RCT in classic BI fashion, tried a few different arms, tried the social norms, various others, and we found that basically highlighting the costs, or the avoided costs when we ran in Australia, to patients was very effective in getting people to turn up. So about a 20% reduction in no-shows for hospital appointments. And this is a £1 billion problem in the UK. And it is, again, figures vary in Australia, but we are talking millions and millions of dollars that are being lost because people don't turn up. And we have the evidence of something that can work just by changing the way that a message is written. And many, many health systems have text messages, but it hasn't been enough to scale it. So actually this intervention in the UK, we've been doing a bit of work over the last few months to work out how far has this scaled. 150 hospitals, about 50 of them have taken it up. So there's still 2/3, which despite senior sort of support for this, really great evidence, some existing systems, it's still not getting through the system. And the same is true in New South Wales. We ran a great trial through the New South Wales Behavioural Insights Unit with St Vinny's, some great results, but we've still only got a few hospitals across the state that are using that. So why is that? In trying to understand sort of why that might be, we've tried to distill what some of the critical success factors are for scale, having had lots of conversations with practitioners in the lead up to this session. Again, if you've ever been to a BIT presentation before, you will understand that we are obsessed with mnemonics, partly because they help you to understand and to sort of remember these in an easy way. This is very much work in progress, so we're really keen to get your feedback today on whether this works for you and if there's bits we're obviously missing out. But when we put it together, we sort of went to the thesaurus and the mnemonic handbook and the crowbar, and we've come up with scale, which works beautifully. And you do actually have to listen to this part, because when we come to the group exercise, each of your roles will be particularly interested in at least one of these factors, okay? So you need to keep an eye on what these are, and then remember these for when we come back to the group exercise. So what do these actually mean? So the first one is sponsorship, or really, who cares? Okay? Have you got your commissioning environment right? Do you have senior executive sponsorship? And we are talking about at the very highest level, because if you are really going to get the resources and sign off to scale, this needs to be something which is signed off at the top. And I think some projects that I've been involved in and seen have stalled where they don't have that very senior buy-in. They get stuck at the sort of middle level, really supportive of the trial, but you need much wider sponsorship than that if it's really going to go to scale. And some of our trials, etc., are quite long, actually. So how do you keep them engaged? And Bruce is going to talk a little bit. It's not good enough to just get the sign-off at the start and say, I'll come back in 12, 18 months with some results. We need to think about how do we keep up that senior sponsorship. And we also need to think about a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So and one thing we've learned is if it's just a sort of diktat from the top and you've got that senior sponsorship, you're never going to get spread through a system. And where we have seen effective sort of scaling through system, it is often because we have that delivery chain all supporting it and some real frontline champions who have delivered it early on and then helped to spread that through the system. And we can be a bit smarter, I think, about how we set that up. So often when we do co-design, and again, I know a word which is often misused these days, but that broad sense of getting people through the delivery system to help design the intervention. And when we set up governance groups, we quite often might have a very senior sponsor and maybe your trial partner. But if you've got an idea that these are going to be the next 5 hospitals or courts that are going next, involve them in the governance or involve them in the co-design. Second, it seems obvious, but again, often I think we come to this too late. What are the costs? What is your business case and your funding source? Ultimately, is it worth it? And again, quite often here, I think as an approach, we've got bogged down in some of the technical details. Countless hours spent on things like p-values. Actually, the p-value we probably really want to care about is practical value, practical impact. You might have got statistical significance, but have you got practical significance? Is this enough to shift the dial? And who's going to pay for it? Quite often, costs and savings are borne by different bits within departments or across departments. So just because you get your business case doesn't mean it's going to get scaled up. You need to think about where can you use budget funding cycles in order to get that signed off. The third is around accountability. Do you have clear levers and reporting structures when you roll this out? Obviously, if the levers at your disposal, if you're something like a tax system versus something like the health system, which is highly decentralized, are very, very different. But once you get through that next level, who is it that's actually going to drive delivery? And do you have a really solid implementation plan for doing that? We know that particularly central, but also departmental BI units often don't have the capacity or the capability to drive the scale. A lot of us have good, we like to think, innovation and technical skills. We are not the people that you want in charge rolling stuff out through a system day in, day out. It's a different set of skills and it's a different capacity that we need. And then how do you learn some of those lessons from implementation science, which Robin will touch on later, about having really good habits, routines and reporting structures so you know that it's being implemented as you want. Two more just quickly before I hand over to Bruce. Logistics. How is it actually going to work in practice? Do you have existing delivery channels or can you create them? Again, easier where you have, you're trying to change a letter or something like that, although not as easy for any of you that have been involved as you might expect. But even text message systems, just because you have a text message system, that doesn't often mean it's got the functionality that you need to drive some of these big scale interventions. That's why we've actually started to produce some platforms like Promptable for the education system, because the existing SMS platforms didn't allow you to randomize or to work out if someone had received the text message. And of course, when you're doing human-centered delivery, you need really good training and coaching, and we'll see that through Arena. You can't just expect to do one training session and a sort of training pack and expect that it's going to be delivered in the way that you want. And the final one is the evidence. Do you have a persuasive evidence base? Again, we were almost obsessive at the beginning about the sort of RCT and then scaling up. I think we're now a little bit more mature in our approach and realise the variety of evaluation methods, quasi-experimental, different ways to do step wedge trials, etc. Sometimes, though, you can't do trials in the field. And actually, we've begun to see the emergence of other platforms. Again, we've got one called Predictive. Well, it allows you to run online trials where you can't get into the field. And Liz Costa today, talking in the energy panel, talk about a trial that we ran there around energy notices and getting people to choose between different deals based on the information presented to them. Couldn't do it in the field. The timelines were too tight. When can we do those sorts of things online? Of course, it's also different. You need to look at the amount of evidence. You can be more confident about going to scale if you've got a wider evidence to draw on. If it's just your single trial, you need to be much more cautious about that. And my final point before I hand over to Bruce is that this is obviously an iterative process. Quite often, again, I think we've seen this as run the trial and then roll out. But often, and we know evidence from the US and elsewhere, that many of those effect sizes are actually diluted when you go to scale. And so actually, it isn't just a case of run the RCT, off you go. We need to be running further testing, further evaluation to work out, well, actually, is it working as we intended, and for who? And we should be taking that sort of test, learn, adapt approach and working out if we haven't got fidelity, what can we do about that? And again, Robin will return to that right at the end in terms of drawing on some of the lessons of implementation science. So I'm going to leave it there and attempt to work the technology to bring Bruce to the stage. Let's see if I can get this right. Nope. Shay, do you want to just make sure? I think I'll just go through now right here. Beautiful. So look, I'm not going to do a long intro for Bruce. He's the acting manager of the economics team at Department of Employment. For those that are you, and I know some of his team are in the room today, many of you have worked with him, Bruce is incredibly down to earth, incredibly humble, and would never talk up his own role in this, but he's been there since the very earliest days of applying BI in Australia. I think he spotted that opportunity early, and he has got a wealth of opportunities, stuff that's worked, stuff that hasn't worked, and so I think he's the perfect person to sort of kick us off with some thoughts of what does this actually look like in practice in the Australian context. Bruce.
Yeah, thanks, Rory. I think, as you say, I think this has been a challenge that we've all been dealing with in the last few years around taking trials to scale. And I share some of the frustration, and today I'm going to go through and talk about one of the examples where it has worked, a specific case example, and where we did run a trial and we were successfully able to roll that out, and hopefully we can learn something as part of that process. So, just quickly, some context. The Department of Jobs and Small Business is really about helping people get into work, and we do this through contracting employment service providers who work with job seekers in a variety of ways to help them get back into work. One of the tools that they have at their disposal is a wage subsidy. So the employment service providers can work with the job seeker, and that's a financial incentive that they can give to the employer to hire a job seeker. However, at the time, the uptake of the wage subsidy was not as high as we would have liked, and with BIT we set about trying to work out why that is and design a trial to test some ways to actually increase the uptake. We found two key issues: administrative complexities, just around the wage subsidy agreement itself and how that was going, and how the wage subsidy itself was framed. So we knew there was a problem. We knew that behavioural economics had potential, but should we do a behavioural economics trial? So then that gets into one of the things that Roy was talking about, which is sponsorship. So for us, the wage subsidy trial was really fertile ground for not only trialling but potentially scaling up in the future. And it was the sponsorship side of things that I think really drove that from the start. So first of all, we had very strong buy-in from our executive. So that was a really good signal for the other people we were working with. This was a genuine problem. It was something that we should be putting resources to. Secondly, there was a broader review already underway. So that certainly helped with creating a bit of an appetite for change. We sort of had a particular area here where we were working with employment service providers. They needed to put some resources up front into the trial. But they could also see if it worked, it was in their financial interest to do so. So that definitely helps. With our review process, or our own research that we did, the qualitative research and process mapping clearly showed there was frustrations with frontline staff of those employment service providers. So they were actually agitating for change and even gave us a lot of good ideas. And one that I think's really important was the people we were working with in the department, particularly our project sponsor, was already a bit of a BE convert before we even started the trial. So this gets to the broader engagement work that people have to undertake, and I think BIT did a really good example at that time of sort of selling what BIT was about to people that weren't necessarily actively doing a behavioural economics trial at the time. So that gave us freedom to trial different things, and it made sure we had sort of buy-in throughout the whole process. So very quickly, what did we do? We had simplified the agreement and turned it online rather than being a paper-based wage subsidy agreement. We front-loaded some of the wage subsidy agreement payments so the employers got them earlier, and we improved the communication and framing that the employment service providers had with the employers. So what happened? Well, we increased wage subsidy uptake. So that was a good result. The trial evidence was pretty supportive of what we were doing, and that it worked. And from there, it was really around integrating that into what was then being considered a youth employment package. And that was the mechanism, if you like, for taking this trial up to which was a fairly localised trial, up to a national scale-up. And that's essentially where the cost argument that you were talking about, Rory, that's covered as part of that budget cycle. So what did we learn? I think one of the key things that, again, Rory spoke about is just how long some of the behavioural economics trials can run for. This was a trial that ran for months, but the budget cycle is not going to wait for us to have a perfect report written up and delivered to somebody's door. So a lot of the time we were presenting interim results. They were still robust, it just meant that there was more timely. Interesting part of change process within departments is that these changes, I suppose in retrospect they seem common sense, but at the time they did involve some change of the risk assessment of the particular program. So paying employers up front was a new thing, it was a bit risky, but having the evidence about what we had done to show that it had worked and being able to present that kind of evidence as the decision was being considered was actually persuasive and able to change people's minds. So a lot of the time that evidence is not a report, that is often just an oral briefing. It could be one line in a brief, it could be a presentation. It takes many different forms and many different people to talk to get that over the line. And I think the other aspect of this is how you integrate accountability and evidence. We actually worked in pretty close partnership with a policy team throughout the trial. And what that meant was, as they were going from trial into scale-up phase, they could really draw on us as the evidence source when they needed it. So it was evidence as needed, not necessarily sort of after the fact. And it kind of gets to the organisational structure issues as well, that we weren't actually the primary responsibility for scaling up, but we were actually a big part of it. And the partnership model really works well in that. So what else did we learn? Just a couple other things about pragmatic approach. A lot of the time when you're talking to people about a trial results and whether you want to scale it up, they're not particularly interested. They've got other things to do. So you've got to make it in some ways in their own interests, what's in it for them. There's always got to come back to it, even internally or within the sort of minister's discussions. Co-design is a big part of that. Being able to reflect on how you can simplify things or make things easier is really quite powerful. And getting staff feedback from on the ground that you sort of got during the trial can be used, I think, quite effectively in the rollout discussions. The other thing, I suppose, is just around the many stakeholders involved in a scale-up discussion. So we had a policy team, we also had an IT team, we also had a behavioural economics team, amongst others, working together on this scale-up. We had various committees that were involved, obviously the Minister's office. So all of that really does need a multidisciplinary team working together well. Then there's the sort of interesting discussion around what's the benchmark of the evidence that we need. And policy is a very fast-paced process. I don't think people are talking about p-values again. I don't think p-values really come into people's consideration in this environment. Of course we want to have robust evidence, but it's sufficient for people to be able to, as I say, if it was a change in their processes, a little bit risky, they needed sufficient evidence to point them in that was an acceptable way to go. The final thing, I suppose, to finish on, I suppose, is just how B is only really part of the puzzle. We'll find every time we look at these scale-up decisions, the evidence that we gather is combined with that real on-the-ground program logistics evidence and know-how. So you have to be able to work with teams that are bringing that different kind of expertise to the table. And of course, everyone here would agree that behavioural economics is one of the best forms of evidence, but in the policy process, it's just one of many, and they'll use a bit of behavioural economics, they'll use some other evidence over there. So you've got to be persuasive, you've got to really sell what you do and how important it is. The last thing is just around scaling up. The aspects of our intervention that was scaled up was not the entire trial, there was just bits of the trial that was scaled up. And that's really to do with how we prototype things and how we deliver prototypes. There's often a slightly different delivery system to the way things are scaled up at a national level. Priorities change, so that's just something to keep in mind. Just echoing finally Rory's point, I think within the behavioural economics trialling space, I don't think scaling up is really the norm yet. We're not quite there. It's probably more in the minority of cases. But hopefully this shows it is possible, and I think there's some real good evidence that we can take from this and lessons that we can learn and make more of it in the future.
All right, so as I noted, Edwina unfortunately can't be with us today. She's at a conference overseas. I'm delighted that we can bring you here by video. We've also got lots of people, or several people in the room today who have also worked on the intervention. If you want to speak to them after, we've got Eva down at the front from the New South Wales Behavioural Insights Unit. Karen from our team has been involved. I think there is someone somewhere here from the Justice Department, and hopefully from the Aboriginal Services Unit in here as well. And two things. One, this has genuinely been one of the most enjoyable, challenging, but ultimately rewarding projects I've ever worked on, both in BI or elsewhere. It's an incredibly important issue, and I think the partnership between the different agencies to undertake this work has been incredible. Hopefully that comes across in the video. And the second thing, again, is just to keep an eye on the actual technique here, which is around mental contrasting implementation intentions, what's often sort of referred to as WOOP in the literature, because that technique is what we are going to be using for the group exercise after this session. So I'll leave it there and hopefully hand over to Edwina. Edwina.
Pragmatic pause.
Feel okay? And I did think, just before we get there, I did think I mentioned Edwina's title. So Edwina is the Director of the Aboriginal Services Unit. They sit within the Justice Department and undertake a sort of range of different work across the New South Wales justice system, not just DV. This is one part of a much broader work programme for them. And actually the video was shot, which I just think is quite a nice example of, I guess, scaling in practice, where we drew together Aboriginal court support workers from across the 46 sites where this is being delivered to try and think about how do we increase take-up and how do we increase fidelity to the program. So the video that you will see, hopefully now, is from that session.
My name is Edwina Crawford. I'm the Director of the Aboriginal Services Unit in the Department of Justice. I'm the very proud Barkindji woman from Western New South Wales. Breaches of apprehended domestic violence orders, or what we call ADVOs, are really common amongst Aboriginal defendants turning up at court. What Your Plan has given us an opportunity to do something a little bit different with them that's grounded in the behavioural science, having discussions that help them identify the challenges of keeping up with that order, what we can do if something happens and they can't meet their orders, and then get them to identify a motivation why they should comply and why it's important for them.
Well, What's Your Plan is based on the behavioural science of mental contrasting and implementation intentions. It's been trialled in a number of different domains and it's worked really successfully in so many studies, hundreds of studies.
We held a trial in just 5 sites across the state. We had a regional court, a very remote court and a very busy metropolitan court, and what that did was allowed us to test the tools and the materials with our staff and see how they happen and fold out in real time.
And we've seen these types of behavioural techniques, but we've never used it in a really complex environment like domestic violence and in the sort of courthouse. So this was a real learning experience for us to think about how do we adapt it for that type of a situation, as well as working really closely with Edwina and Jeremy and the team at the Aboriginal Services Unit to make sure that the language, the artwork even, and the materials are really well adapted for the Aboriginal community.
The approach that we took with the training was really a sort of staged approach. We started with a full day workshop face-to-face with every staff member where we took them through the principles behind the approach, making sure that we continue to upskill our staff and address any feedback or concerns that they have.
In follow-up to that, we've done some refresher training for staff who didn't quite grasp what we delivered to them in the first instance, and then coach them through how they might do things better, how they did do things as well, and make sure that they really understand the concept.
A good example might be if someone has an order that they can't drink alcohol and then go home within 24 hours. We know that lots of defendants, when they leave court, haven't really thought through how they're going to comply with that. So this helps them to sit down and think through, well, if I do drink, what am I going to do? And make a very specific plan. So if I drink on a Friday night, I will call Uncle Bob and make sure I can stay there.
It's the old adage, we don't plan to fail, but we fail to plan. And the What's Your Plan is exactly that. We're not setting them up to fail anymore, but it's setting them up to plan.
A particular story from one of our staff members was that they were initially sceptical of What's Your Plan. They didn't think it'd work with our defendants, but now that the program has been going for almost 12 months, he has completely turned the corner because he's seen the value and the changes in the attitudes and orientations of defendants that he works with since making a plan. He's made almost 18 of them now and only 2 people have breached, so 16 people have complied with their plan and he hasn't seen them since. And so he's seeing continually the benefits of working with the defendants to keep them compliant and on track, but also help keep the victim safe as well.
One of our staff members commented once that some of these young offenders have never had anybody in their life ask them what their goals are. So entering this court environment and having somebody who is from your community, who's interested in your well-being and who's sitting down having a conversation with you about how you can rehabilitate and be a better person is something that is just so special in terms of what we bring.
The thing I like most about What's Your Plan is it gives the offender the opportunity to take ownership and unpack their behaviour, and it helps them to look at what is behind it and how they could fix it. That's the beauty of it. They're part of the solution rather than just seeing themselves as the problem.
I like to track them along on their journey to see how they're going. Could be 6 months, could be 12 months, but I'd like to see at the end if they've got a drinking problem. My very first plan that I did with a gentleman in Dubbo, he's saving his money instead of drinking for a pilot licence. And he's got the support of his partner, he's got a job which he loves and he wants to keep, and I just think, wow.
Some of the responses are, I'm so glad I was able to come up with this plan, it's helped me in this situation. My family have actually acknowledged my efforts. They're so glad that I've been able to do something like this. It shows that I'm actually trying.
So we probably made a lot of people nervous by wanting to go statewide so quickly after the pilot, but it was filling a really urgent need with Aboriginal defendants, and we were really keen to see what it looks like and how it works. We have so many different varieties of courts and different environments they operate in. We thought to get the best chance to understand how this is going to get the best result for Aboriginal defendants, we needed to roll out statewide. To really get a sense of whether What's Your Plan works, we are partnering with the Bureau of Statistics and Crime Research here in New South Wales, who are doing an outcomes evaluation of our trial, so that we'll get the participants who have been in the trial and the impact it has had on their breach rates over time, and we'll be comparing that to other defendants in other courts who haven't had access to What's Your Plan.
So the other really exciting thing about What's Your Plan is it's now statewide. So that's been a challenge for us to train workers across 46 different court sites and think about how we need to vary that for different types of courts.
So in our regional remote areas, our staff are more engaged in the community. They often live and work in that community. Knowing who to approach, who might be the best candidate to offer it to, is intel that they have. In the metro courts, they don't have that so much.
Trying to deliver an intervention in a uniform way across so many different sites, and to do that when you don't have face-to-face contact with staff every day is a challenge. So taking into account all those factors and ensuring that we can still maintain the fidelity of the intervention is something that's been really, really important.
I think one really essential element of this trial has been having good partners that are flexible, that listen to one another and collaborate well. Based on our experience of rolling out What's Your Plan, I think a broader rollout amongst the whole community is something that would really add value to the domestic violence landscape.
I think it's very achievable. It is a big undertaking, but I think it's being done with the right people who've got the right attitude, and I know that those workers don't want to see Aboriginal people continuously going into the system. They want to take it up with gusto and support the implementation of it so as that we can affect change for men and women in the community who are on domestic violence orders and who want to change, and making sure that we have the workers well supported to do that will get the best result.
If I could go back in time, I wouldn't change anything about our What's Your Plan trial rollout. I'm glad that we just bit the bullet and went big at the start and had the flexibility within the evaluation and the actual behavioural science approach to build and generate better outcomes for our staff and our participants as we've gone along.
Give a sense of that intervention, and again we're going to have Q&A at the end. We'll also have during this group exercise some facilitators from the Behavioural Insights team who are at the back helping sort of guide the conversation, so if you've got any questions on the content of the intervention you can also ask them. So I'm just going to hopefully again move forward to, it's time to put you all to work now, which is great news. As I said, this is the first time we've run this, so it's going to be a lot of fun. We're asking you to do some method acting, all get deep into character, hopefully not too deep, but I'll explain what that means in a minute. So the intervention that we're going to be using for this case study is around something called the financial planning conversation. And just to be clear, this is a hypothetical intervention. This is not something we've done or anything. This is a hypothetical case study for the purposes of this session. And I want you to imagine that this magical group called the Nudge Collective have recently completed a trial with social housing tenants on income support to plan how they can better manage their budgets. The intervention was trialled in a small scale, in a small housing estate in Brisbane earlier this year. And the trial found that the financial planning conversation significantly decreased the likelihood that social housing tenants fell into arrears within 3 months. And it was based on the WHOOP intervention developed by Gabrielle Ottigan and Peter Goldwitzer. And you can see there the effect size about 6 percentage points from that initial trial. So in terms of what that conversation looks and feels like, you will have some materials shortly on your desk which will take you through in sort of a physical form what that conversation looks like and how the wish conversation plays out in practice. So that the conversation, so you start with what someone's wish is, then you ask them to define what the outcome, what the best possible outcome might be and how they can imagine that. You then go through what some obstacles might be to achieving that outcome? And finally, how do you plan to achieve that outcome and get over those obstacles through simple if-then plans? So again, you're going to find some materials on your table in a minute. Don't worry too much about the sort of deep behavioural science of this. If you're not familiar, I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with mental contrasting implementation intention, so that's why we chose this example. Lessons from this small-scale trial. So 3 main ones. First is that the conversations on average took about 18 minutes, but the variance in time was huge, okay? So your longest conversations were taking more than a couple of hours and going through people's life stories and all sorts of interesting but not necessarily that helpful conversations. In terms of the content, tenants often built plans that weren't directly related to leaving social housing, but the emerging evidence seems to suggest that they were still effective in stopping them from falling into rental arrears. And finally, we had as part of that small-scale trial that tenants could write down their signatures, try and personalise that part of the intervention, and they really liked that, but that did create a few issues in terms of the paperwork and the tenancy officers wanting to keep a copy for themselves. So, in terms of the timing, you're going to have 20 minutes in total. So the first 5 minutes, just to read the sort of one-page instructions in the magical envelopes, which will be delivered shortly. Sit down, read that, and there should be someone else on your table, unless you're a media advisor, which I'll speak about in a minute, who will have the same role as you, and just speak to them about, well, what is it that you want to achieve, and what are the main changes that you think you want to make to this conversation in order for it to be scaled up. So 5 minutes on your own and in a pair. Then 10 minutes is the sort of on-the-table discussion. And so you should start off by telling everyone on the team what your character is and what you're trying to achieve, and then start to discuss what are the types of changes you want to make to this conversation in order to take it to scale. And then in the final 5 minutes, we want you to wrap up, take a decision about how you want to take this forward, and there are a few different options which you will find on the table, and the Minister's Policy Advisor will know. And you might want to discuss, well, what's the option that we want to take forward, and are there any other barriers that we can see, and how might we overcome that? So first 5 minutes in pairs, 10 minutes sort of bulk of the discussion around the tables, 5 minutes sort of wrapping up and making your decision. And in terms of the roles, there are 6 different roles. So you have the Minister's Policy Advisor, who is ultimately the sort of key project sponsor and will be taking the call around whether and how this is taken forward. You also have the media advisor, you have a senior treasury official, you have a frontline manager, a learning and development officer, and an academic, all who have a slightly different interest and a slightly different set of things that they want to get out of this scale-up, which you will find on your inside your magical coloured envelopes, which I think are coming around now. So if I just ask the facilitators to come round and give out the very exciting envelopes. So we'll give you a shout when you've had 5 minutes, and then with 5 minutes to go. I think we're on time, surprisingly. So 12 o'clock, I think it finishes at 12:45. This should take 20 minutes. This must finish at 12. Does this finish at 12:30? 11:15, no, 12:45, right? Yeah, we're ahead of time. We're ahead of time. Get into the Q&A. I think there's going to be some Q&A. Especially that last one. I could just see you just need to. Okay, that's your first 5 minutes. You should now be moving into the group discussion about what you want to do. Introduce your role, your objective, and the changes you want to make. Over to you. Okay, team, you're about halfway through that group discussion, that 10 minutes. Start trying to have discussions now on what it is you actually want to change and take to scale. Okay, we're moving into the final 5 minutes. So again, ultimately the Minister's Policy Advisor is the key sponsor and will be making the call. So you want to be persuading them. And your last 5 minutes to also identify those key roadblocks, which your facilitators are then going to give to Robin to reflect on, okay? So what's the decision? The Minister's Policy Advisor is going to take the call from your table. You need to persuade them. And what are those roadblocks you can feed back to your facilitators? 5 minutes to go. I want to make a bad gag about something. Okay, no. Okay, 3 minutes. I'll take minutes of policy or facilitate. Is it 1 minute? Okay, 1 minute to make your decision. Minister's Policy Advisor, it's crunch time. Okay, 20 seconds. Alrighty, let's leave it there. Good work. Lots of good energy, conversation, deep role play. Looks like no one fell out too much, which is good news. So before I hand over to Robin, who's going to help sort of bring some of the feedback together, quick show of hands from the facilitator or the Minister's Policy Advisor. Who went for option 1, which was rolling out the financial planning conversation exactly as is? Any groups rolling it out exactly as is? Nope. All right, option 2, adapting it in some way. And we'll probably come back with some... Okay, and hopefully Robin's got a bit of an intel there coming back from facilitators about some of the key changes that you made, which is excellent. Any of you just go for the pure digital option, just delivering this solely online? Tried, but no. It's good. Robots aren't taking over just yet, which is good. Okay, and number 4, who hit the stop now? Anyone kill the project? Stop it dead? No, some near misses. Okay, so good. So it sounds like most of you, although there were a series of barriers and things to overcome, did to find a way forward, which is fantastic. So I'm now just going to hand over to Dr. Robin Milden, who's going to help bring this all together. When I first heard about implementation science, it sounded extremely dry and that it wouldn't add a huge amount of value. And then I met Robin and all of that flipped on its head. She makes it sound extremely exciting and interesting. And actually, I think there's huge potential, not just from learning from implementation science in what we do, but also bringing the two approaches together. So I'll hand over to Robin.
Thank you. And can I check who's in charge of the time here? Okay, so you need to throw something at me, or because this is going to take a while. So firstly, just as Rory was sceptical about the application of implementation science in practice, he's come to the light. And I am expecting all of you to do the same in the next 10 minutes. Don't be too distracted, Minister Advisors, those of you in that role play by the word science. I know it's not always in favour, but the academics will feel super comfortable with it. So what I'm going to do is give Rory some immediate feedback on his team. They really need to work with their writing. So some of these, and this is a common implementation barrier, I can't understand them. And in fact, one table picked up an awesome common issue when trying to either take things to the stage of implementation or to scale, which is a whole lot of terms in there, around not standardised, so unclear how to do it, not enough information to confidently take it to scale. So that's a really super important issue that the implementation science research and practice area discusses. Knowing the effectiveness of something in trials tells you absolutely nothing about how to implement it in the real world. So we have to sort of park that effectiveness story and then switch our heads. And one of the things that can be particularly challenging, and I think this is what this table picked up on, if something isn't described sufficiently and is actionable and doable, it's unimplementable already. So if you think about our front line, we ask a lot across health, education and human services of the front line by, in the main, using the one most common strategy to support implementation. And what would that be? Somebody should totally call that out. Because every single table talked about it, which was interesting. When we talk about implementation, what's the one thing we all start talking about? Training the front line. Poor old front line. Basically, our entire hopes for revolutionising all our sectors is on the poor old front line, who often earn the least amount of money, have the least amount of time, and then we use one common strategy, which is training, and guess what the science says about the effectiveness of training to help people learn how to do new things? Rubbish. Meta-analysis after meta-analysis after meta-analysis has repeatedly shown us that using training alone, no matter how good that training is insufficient in most cases. There's an odd 5% that may come out of training fully able to implement, but in most cases is insufficient. So when we're thinking about implementing, we need to think about what else can we do in addition to training that we can afford, because there was an enormous amount of comments around resources and money and how much resource did we have to take. It's pretty expensive to implement poorly. In fact, it's an absolute waste of money. So we've got tons and tons and tons of examples across the world and in Australia, and I recently presented to the ministers here in New South Wales about how much it costs to implement badly. And how, if we use just training by itself with no other strategies, things often disappear. We have to bring the trainers or re-implement the training all the way through. So the next thing I wanted to comment on is there's a real theme in these about everyone was going digital all of a sudden. So it sounds like people were thinking about, hopefully a way to take to scale was moving the training to a digital platform. Do some groups go there? Don't deny it. I've got it written down. I have it. Unless the BIT guys were actually making it up, which is a good... Actually, I've met their staff. Most of them do make it up. But here's the thing. Digital is just a mode, right? So when we're thinking about taking to scale, that's kind of that's the least significant thing we want to think about. The thing we want to think about is it usable? Can we do it? And what are the additional implementation strategies that we need to build? And there's this whole cool thing in implementation science called how low can you go? So what's the least amount you can add into your implementation plan to get the effect? So I think digital probably makes it more transportable and usable, but as this, again, the sole strategy, digital and training, for implementing this, the science would say we will not get to the concept of fidelity, which I'm going to comment on in a second. I love this. How hard do we need to be on fidelity? Here's the thing. There's a lot of emphasis on it. We just need to just relax a little. So I actually had the minister ask me recently, how do I get that thing to fidelity? And I was like, I'm not even sure that thing should be taken to fidelity, because sometimes we can implement something really well that does more harm, right? And there's a lot of examples in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs in Australia where we have in fact done that. So when we think about how hard do we need to get to fidelity, fidelity is just another type of data, right? And when you're trying to evidence taking something into real-world services, so the ultimate definition of implementation is that it becomes business as usual. Standard practice, it's in the system, right? But fidelity has three components to it. Did we stick to the plan that we had intended? To the right amount, dose, and with what quality? So when we're dealing with humans, the quality with which things are done is extremely important in terms of how well the implementation is carried out. But unless you have that data, you have no idea. So in a lot of projects we've seen, when I ask people to think about what data they're collecting to evidence implementation, they'll often give me stats on training. So participation in training. So that's a way to do something right, but that doesn't tell us anything in terms of, is it being implemented as planned? To what extent? Is it even acceptable to the poor old people that we seem to be implementing this with? Is it feasible? Is it usable? These are all things called implementation outcomes. So we really encourage people to think about the data that you need to collect to evidence whether implementation is occurring, and, because this will happen naturally at systems, what adaptations are needed. So one of the key things, and one of the things the implementation science literature has shown me, you're taking something to scale, is thinking about what are the core components that in the original study you really needed to stick to, like that gives you your effect, but what are the adaptations that can be done or localised? Because the system's naturally going to do that anyway, and that's something to learn about. There's been some fabulous studies showing the quality of implementation is higher when some local adaptation is allowed that doesn't affect the effectiveness of the intervention. So what I didn't see here in any of this was that thinking about the data, there's some sort of quip at the poor old academics. I'm a reformed academic. Like, I don't mind, I like them, you know, nothing wrong. Poor old academics, there's a comment about them wanting to collect more and more data. Now stop that. All right? We all just have to make a rule. The way to put the front line and anybody else off using and collecting data is to make them collect things that are meaningless, right? I don't know why we keep doing this. So we have these really nice little kind of boxes that we can help people fill in. You get really pragmatic with your measurement. The measurement has to be meaningful to your stakeholders. And you're thinking about what's the bare amount of data I can collect to evidence implementation, see what adaptations are made, and how is that related to achieving outcomes. Because there's no point measuring implementation unless you're going to measure outcomes. It makes no sense. But what we don't do is measure implementation. We often go straight to the outcome. She is talking me down, timing-wise. I'm going to say this last thing because I'm getting nudged down there. I had to with this conference. No one makes enough funny jokes about it. Like I say to Rory all the time, no amount of nudging is going to make me go to the gym, buddy. Not a single, it's not happening. I may or may not go, it's up to me. I liked that second keynote. So the last thing that I think is important to say is that the funniest thing about talking about going to scale is we don't know a lot about it. So there's this joke in the implementation science practice and research area where we talk about, has anything been sustained enough to figure out what enabled it to stick and how do we improve it? So it's still all a little bit theoretical, right? So we still have an enormous amount to learn. I will stop there, Rory. All right.
Thanks, Robin. So look, we've got about 10 minutes left for questions, either on the specific exercise, sort of points on implementation science, or the earlier presentations from Bruce and Edwina. I think we have a couple of you in the audience who can answer them as well. So throw it open. Any questions? Just take it at the front here. Do we have the fun microphone? Yeah. Are we doing the throw thing, or is that? No. Nah, I think that's... Cool, maybe just say who you are. Yeah. Or...
Really?
Yeah.
That's distracting. So this exercise was an example of scaling a complex, difficult intervention in a complex policy space.
Yeah.
Some nudges aren't. You know, sign first to have people be more honest is an incredibly straightforward piece of form design. Sending SMSs to get people to attend things they've already agreed to attend, incredibly straightforward. So I'm interested in your reflections on kind of what has worked or what could work to get to scale, just the real basics.
Yeah. So I think it's a great question. How much replication do you need before you just start implementing these? Actually, the signatures is a great example. It's been well replicated in US studies in a number of fields, but it's actually failed to replicate in a few policy trials in the UK, including in the tax office. So in fact, one we were involved in early on was around single person benefit, and we moved the signature to the front, and actually it had the reverse effect. It seemed to have a perverse outcome, and we've used it also in the tax space, and it seemed to have no effect. So even with those areas where we think there is a really well established base, I think it is important. For me, this area that we're doing it around single person benefit was actually different in a number of ways, including that the original studies looked at people declaring an amount, like expenses or an amount, and this was a simple yes, no, do I deserve this benefit or not? And actually there might be something fundamentally different about using signatures at the front when you're asking people to declare a number versus whether they just can get a benefit or not. More broadly, though, Phil, I think the point is exactly right, is do we spend too much time sort of fiddling around with trials, etc., where we have a pretty well-established evidence base? And I think that is a good question. I think then it is about how do you build in some of those measures so that we don't just assume it is working, but you are doing an evaluation, and you, again, the amount of data you need to collect for something relatively simple like that is probably much more limited. The one thing I would say, and I totally agree with Robin's point, and maybe throw it to you in a second, is we do ask too much of the front line in terms of our data, and actually that creates a lot of a friction with a lot of our trials. But I also think sometimes we look at a relatively narrow set of data, actually, and something I'm quite interested in is maybe if we're helping people with these conversations, it's actually helping, and it would be possible potentially, even in the domestic violence intervention we've seen, there are wider benefits around people's financial planning or health. We don't capture any of that at the minute. We focus very much on this intervention, X does Y, and we measure that. And I think that is also where I think this approach can go next. Bruce?
I want to add one thing, but I'm scared of my voice. I meant to say this before, and excuse me for the pun. Systems trump programs. But no matter, saying our social systems here, particularly in a couple of states in Australia at the moment, we're really working hard to bring some programs from other places as our response to decreasing kids going into out-of-home care. And our systems keep trumping those programs. They find it very hard to get into our system. They do not stick. There's some awesome examples of trying to kind of transport things across, say, the US into the UK that didn't work at all. Millions and millions of dollars put in. So systems, no matter how good that program is, the system can always trump it. And so it's thinking about the invisible infrastructure, we talk about that, behind what's actually happening beyond training, because that can kind of get in the way or help. It's thinking about that sometimes how matters a lot more than what. How it's implemented can affect it. How the quality of the implementation can increase how beneficial the program is by 2 to 3 times in some studies in juvenile justice, even with very sort of average programs being implemented.
One other thing on quickly on SMSs or even letter change interventions. The aspect of taking things to scale is something you've got to almost build as a system design feature before you're doing the trialling. So we do a lot of work with our IT areas building SMS systems that enable us to test it potentially at scale later on, or to test in a randomised controlled trial way from the start. In the same way with letters or anything that seems a simple change from a systems point of view, it can be almost a 6-month lead time to change one line sometimes, or there's a bunch of other priorities that have been just announced, and so you can have a great trial that's going to be successful, but it's just not a priority. So making sure that can somehow link into other things going on is important as well.
Great point. Question at the back, I think. Anne.
Hi, Anne Hollins from the Australian Institute of Family Studies. I agree completely with the systems point that you made, Robin. At our conference next month, we've got a session called System Reform, Is It Dead? Or Was It Ever Alive? So my question really is, when are you, Rory, when are you going to start using BI to actually achieve system reform, and what instead of all this programmatic stuff?
Yeah.
Interesting though it is.
Yeah.
But here we're talking about scale. So when do you think we're going to go there?
Good question, good challenge. I won't claim personal accountability, hopefully, for that one. But I think we are starting to see it, and actually in the domestic violence space, we're still in the very early stages, but thinking what are those different elements of the court process and system, from the court forms to people turning up to what happens in court to after. If we look at something like obesity, actually, I think it's a great example of where we ran a very small-scale trial in Victoria with Vic Health and Alfred Health around things like price incentives. So putting a small tax, effectively, on sugar-sweetened beverages, Cokes, and having that differential. And that trial fed into wider evidence that then went to the UK, which enabled us to introduce a sugar tax. And that has now just bitten in the UK, and we have already seen huge reformulations of products in the sort of drink space. So it doesn't even matter if, as a consumer, I still buy the sort of full fat drink, because the products are already being reformulated on the producer's side. So I think that is where we go next. I think that is the challenge. And again, if we can be back in 4 years and have a few ones on the board, that will have been a huge achievement. But I think it is part of that evolution of the approach. I do think we had to make the case, we had to build the confidence of senior people in government. I think we are starting to get there. I think the sort of battle's won, but I think we have a suite of results that you'll hear over the next 2 days, which allows us to be a bit more ambitious. And I think you're exactly right, Anne. If in 4 years we're still talking about sort of individual trials rather than big systematic changes, we probably have failed. All right, I'm getting the rounded up sign from Erin. So look, just a quick thank you, big hand to our speakers here today, Bruce Cunningham and Robin Milden.